Hey fellow filmmakers, Clifton Stommel here. Now, you may notice that the aspect ratio of today's video is a little different than previous ones, and that's because we're filming on an anamorphic lens. This is in honor of the fact that today we're actually reviewing an anamorphic lens. Today we're here to talk about the Vazen 40mm 1.8X Anamorphic made specifically for micro four thirds sensors. Now, while I am going to touch base on the technical aspects of this lens, I do want to point out that most of this video is going to be focused on the real world applications where we're taking this away from the studio, away from controlled environments, on the road, and seeing how it performs in the universe in which you actually are using a micro four thirds system. Small and compact cameras that can go pretty much anywhere. So let's get to it. First thing I noticed right out of the box is this lens's size. Now we know that when we're shooting on a micro four thirds system, we have access to much smaller lenses and cool adapters and things, like a speed booster. And this is no exception. For an anamorphic lens of this quality, for it to be this small is actually a pretty shocking thing, which still helps bringing it out into the field and doing some really cool mobile environment, mobile shooting stuff that you wouldn't normally get access to with a much larger rig without additional support or crew or, needing to be the Hulk. And the build quality is pretty superb. It's definitely a fully metal body all the way through, and even the front cap, you notice it takes a little work to get it off of there. The cap on this lens has a nice little sort of rubberized kind of foam ring on the inside, which makes it really hold on the front of this. I know that the only person who's had this complaint with cinema lenses before, that cup style lens cap can just kind of fall off. So it's really nice that the Vazen company put a little something in here that actually grips the front of the lens, so this never accidentally falls off in transit or when your AC goes to pick it up and it just tumbles off the front. Moving over to the back side of this lens, given that micro four thirds is a push and snap in lens interface with a little pin that clicks up into place, you will have a little bit of wiggle. It's not a super tight fit. So you're gonna wanna get something like a lens support of some kind. Anything you can do to keep this thing from rotating a little bit is great. It shouldn't be too much of an issue because the focus ring isn't really overly stiff. It is a smooth focus ring. It doesn't have a lot of resistance or tension. It's not gonna cause too much extra wiggle, but if you are rapidly pulling focus between two subjects at any given distance, your follow focus may end up pushing a little bit too much in either direction. You may introduce a little bit of wobble there. So definitely worth having a lens support for an additional point of contact, at least when you're filming with this guy in an environment where you really need it to be just so. The last thing I want to mention on the build quality, as any good proper cinema lens, your aperture ring is declicked. It has a 0.8 pitch gear, and the focus throw is 300 degrees, which is really nice for getting that perfectly fine, super small focus, just moving with subjects or, really nailing exactly where you want the focus to land in the frame. However, given the price point of this particular lens, I'm pretty confident it's going to attract a lot of filmmakers who aren't operating at this extremely high level where they're accustomed to having a first AC and a wireless follow focus and a wireless video kit on every set they're working on. You got to remember that when you're working with a lens like this, it is designed to be used with a first AC, with a wireless follow focus, a system that can rapidly move and control such a far focus throw. Because if you're in the middle of filming with this lens and you're trying to do a quick rack focus from close to far, you're going to end up having to let go and regrip a number of times. The Vazen Anamorphic is actually a really sharp lens. It's like surprisingly sharp and high contrast, with a very modern look, and honestly, this thing really stacks up. I think that if you're trying to get a good modern anamorphic look, you're shooting a science fiction thriller or you're doing something outdoors at night and you really want that, that cool anamorphic night look, this is a good lens to do that. Given that it is sharp and has such great contrast, it means that it's highly filterable. So if you want more of a classic Western look, a little more of that old sort of vintage glass, given that this is a good, sharp, high contrast starting point, you can definitely use a lot of filters to soften that, to bring that down, put some other lens elements in front, and sort of play with prisms if you want to. You can really start to do some cool stuff. It's a little bit harder when you're working with a lens that already has a sort of a softer, filmier, old school look to it. Bringing that into a more modern aesthetic can be more challenging than going in and filtering and softening down a more modern looking lens. As you can see in some of my footage here, we shot with the lens directly on the sensor to showcase just how sharp it can be and how those flares look really modern and really nice. And other instances we shot with our own collection of filters and additional pieces of glass in front of the lens, embracing how some of the imperfections translate through the glass. As you can see, when the lens is just directly on the sensor with no additional filters, it does a really good job of holding up and showing this sort of modern look, like I said, with the flares and everything you'd expect. And as you start filtering and adding additional pieces of glass and whatever you want in front of it, you start to build a kind of a lookbook of different options you can use this particular lens for. You get this kind of squeezing, squishing effect with the focus racks, which when it comes to an anamorphic lens is part of, I guess, what you want. Your in-focus and out-of-focus areas are changing dimensions. So when asking, does this lens focus breathe, the answer is yeah, kind of, but what anamorphic doesn't in that anamorphic way? When it comes to sensor coverage and vignetting with a lens like this, you have to remember that your goal is actually to shoot on a 4:3 aspect ratio crop in the center of your 16:9 aspect ratio sensor, because a 1.8x or 2x anamorphic is going to de-squeeze to your 2.35 to 2.4 to 1 cinemascope aspect ratio. What is nice about this is that you actually do get full sensor coverage on a camera like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, which allows you to do a 1.8x de-squeeze from 16:9 all the way out to around 3.2 to 1, which is a crazy sort of sweeping view, which is really nice for landscapes and exterior environments where you want to really showcase just how immense the space is you're filming, and it may give you some really neat effects. It's a pretty extreme aspect ratio to expect an audience to sit through for narrative unless you're going for a really specific look. But what I did notice is when you're shooting the 4:3 aspect ratio, all your camera's doing is cropping off pixels on the side, which means you're working with the same number of vertical pixels anyway, so if you're not hurting for hard drive space, you can go ahead and just shoot full sensor. Yeah, there's some vignetting, and it's not optically designed to actually be seen all the way to the edges of the glass. But what's nice about this is, if your end goal is to get a 2.4 or 2.35 to 1 aspect ratio, you have room now to scale your frame up and have horizontal room to slide your frame a little bit. Those of us who shoot on a 16:9 sensor with the intention of ending in a cinema crop and giving ourselves a little vertical room to readjust frames, as I'm sure all of us have done a number of times, this basically gives you the horizontal, real anamorphic version of doing that, only you have left and right room. You gotta remember when you're shooting with an anamorphic though, you do not give yourself any headroom, top or bottom, to adjust your frame after. So you really gotta nail your framing, try not to give people haircuts, and try not to cut interesting things people are holding out of the bottom of the frame. When it comes to the real world field use of our Vazen anamorphic lens, we went to some pretty remote locations, filming under some inopportune conditions, and it really didn't inconvenience me at all to use this thing in a desert ghost town, or in a snowy mountain range, or in the flooded flats out in the middle of absolute nowhere. The convenience of the size and form factor of this particular lens really gives you a chance to get some super cinematic looks in some pretty remote and hard to reach environments. When it comes to shooting full sensor coverage to get the maximum room to de-squeeze in post or squeeze for extra sharpness, you gotta remember that in-camera pre-visualization tools are gonna primarily stick with doing a 1.3x de-squeeze when you're shooting full sensor 16:9 or DCI 4K, and a 2x de-squeeze when you're shooting the 3 to 4 aspect ratio anamorphic for something like a 2x lens. So when you're shooting with this 1.8x, you're pretty much gonna have to use an external monitor that lets you dial in a custom squeeze or custom aspect ratio so that you can actually see how your focus is looking, how your composition is looking. I use something like the Portkeys BM7 to actually do a custom scaling of the vertical pixels and create my aspect ratio so that I can create exactly the full view of what I'm looking at. Of course, those are all things on the camera side that Vazen doesn't have any control over. A few things that I would like to see improved though, I'd like the aperture ring to be a little tighter, because if it's bumped, you may adjust your exposure when you don't necessarily want to. Again, I don't know if the aperture ring on the retail units are maybe a little bit tighter than this one. Vazen did send me a demo unit, which when it comes to demo units, they could be late prototypes or they could be just really field abused versions of the one that you're going to buy in the final retail packaging. So I don't know offhand if this is going to be tighter on final release or if this is how they are, but from my experience here, this could be a little tighter to hold a little better when you bump it. And again, given the Micro Four Thirds mount having a little bit of wobble and the, slight adjustments between different camera manufacturers, them making the MFT on this end tighter is going to be more of a challenge than maybe even just adding a 1/4 screw thread to the bottom, like they do with the Micro Four Thirds to PL lens adapters that have that little thread, or realistically most speed boosters like the Metabones have the little 1/4 thread in the bottom so that it locks it to the camera's cage. They could release perhaps a little foot or something that would screw into these little screw threads along this ring. They could allow it to give you a 1/4 to actually lock it directly to your cage, which would fully eliminate any sort of Micro Four Thirds lens mount wobble. But other than that, honestly, this is a pretty stellar lens. Given the price and given the quality of the image that it produces and the filterability and the full sensor coverage of Micro Four Thirds, this is a very cinematic lens. It's a very professional tool. I think the price point is going to help a lot of Micro Four Thirds users decide to go ahead and keep the camera they're working with and start getting into these proper pieces of cinema glass for their ecosystem. I know I'm going to be using this a lot more on shoots that I'm using my Pocket 4K on, and you should always get a hold of something, test it before you buy it, come to your own conclusions. This is one man's opinion, one cinematographer with one kind of aesthetic and preferences, and thank you again so much for watching. If you like this video, if you think it's worthwhile, if you think it's helpful, if you know any other Micro Four Thirds shooters who are potentially looking into getting into the cinema space with a proper anamorphic lens, give it a comment, give it a share, give it a like, let everybody know about it. I'll always try to reply to every single person who has anything to say or anything to ask on my channel. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks again.